This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host Gilad Halpern, and today's interview is being recorded on the premises of the 2016 conference of the Association for Israel Studies here in Jerusalem. My guest today is an associate professor of Israeli literature and culture at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and she's joining me here to discuss her recent research interests, land, gender, and the cowboy in the Israeli Western. Dr. Rachel Harris, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hello, thank you for having me here.
So let's start with something that really threw me off. Israeli Western, is there really such a thing?
So in the 50s, Israel was the second largest consumer of cinema in the world behind Britain. Obviously, there was no TV, there were no other forms of public entertainment, and cinema was really cheap. And so people went to the movies for entertainment. It was open to the public. It wasn't as highbrow as opera and concerts. And people loved imports. But what they preferred was Hollywood. The critics didn't like this so much, and they wanted them to see more European cinema, high art, lots of culture, and audiences basically walked out. And so a lot of the Hollywood films that we think of as all the kind of classics were being played on the Israeli screen, often with hand-cranked subtitles. Mm-hmm. But the people who ran the subtitles didn't necessarily speak the languages on the film, or they fell asleep, or things were out of sync. So you have this kind of weird mismatch. So the kinds of films that were best for this sort of experience were the kinds where there was lots of action on the screen, slapstick comedies, the kind of cowboy films where the shoot-em-ups were happening so you could see what was going on. Mm-hmm. So as Israeli cinema began to develop, it wanted to create its own homegrown version of the kinds of things that other people were seeing on the screen. And it was all about this experience of Hebrewism and wanting to have the authentic
experience. Before we get to that, did they really have the infrastructure, the budgets to do it?
So they had nothing. And what you often see is the problem is that there's no sound stages, there's no lighting stages. You're taking the camera out to the middle of the desert to film. So you have lots of light, but then if the boom microphone gets too close, you get this big shadow of the boom microphone on the set. So you can either have the boom microphone in the middle of the scene, or you're going to hold it far enough away that it doesn't get picked up in the light, and then you're going to have terrible sound quality. So you see all kinds of these really primitive issues that come up. So in the very end of the 1940s, in 1949, Margaret Klausner sets up the Herzliya studio. She had helped bring Habima to Israel, and so then she begins the process of creating film development labs and then building the Herzliya studios, what we now call the Herzliya studios.
The first real professional film studios in the country.
Yeah, and then after that we get Geva Studios a couple of years later. And so we begin to have these very, very primitive sort of arrangements. But you get a film like Dahlia and the Sailors, made by Geva Studios, and the actors talk about how they basically accosted every ship that landed in the harbor and then used it for a few hours. The problem with this is ships are different shapes. So one minute the entrance would be here and another minute the entrance would be over there, and there was sort of no consistency to it. But everybody sort of viewed these experiences as an artistic pioneering project in the same way that they viewed all of the other kinds of pioneering projects going on in the country.
And were there really memorable productions of Westerns in this country?
So what began is this creation of the Westerns, and the first Westerns were really building on the history of cinema that had happened in the 30s, which were these pioneering films about building the land and sowing the seeds and making the wilderness grow. And so we already had this vocabulary for talking about development. And so then when the Westerns came along, and there are really only about 4 or 5 of them, we're not talking about a huge genre, but then you have to remember they're only making 5 or 6, 7 films a year for decades. So that's still quite a significant number over a 4-year span.
And were they as popular with the audience as the Hollywood ones or the spaghetti ones, or did people really mock them for the poor quality?
So it's slightly problematic. They didn't mock them for the poor quality because they were so excited to have an authentic local Hebrew culture. But were
they in Hebrew, by the way?
They were in Hebrew. They were in Hebrew. But the problem with the films was that they didn't really have the same kind of enthusiasm, because what they did was they combined the traditional genre of the Western that we recognize, seeing the frontier, the lone woman, the lone man on the horse, the teepee in the background, some guns. We even see some Stetsons and some holsters on the sides of people's waists, and this idea of engaging with a cowboy film. But they were also combining particular Israeli qualities. So the idea of developing the land in the Zionist sense rather than in the Wild West sense. We're not seeing cattle roaming across it. We're seeing draining the swamps, removing the salination of the soil, those kinds of things. So we also don't get that east-west coast dichotomy that we see in the traditional Western.
But because the themes in the traditional Western, of the Wild West in general, pioneering, conquering the frontier, etc., could very well resonate with the Zionist state of mind.
Right, absolutely. And it was the same kind of philosophy, this idea of manifest destiny that fed into the American Western was about the same God-given right, the human labor that would redeem the soil, right? Blood, sweat, tears, even your dying and being buried in the soil. We talk about that traditional image of the Boot Hill Cemetery. Well, we're going to see the same thing in the Israeli context, where the body is finally going to be buried in the soil, and that's going to be part of what happens. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the cowboy film, you maybe see a town. At the end of the Israeli cowboy film, you're going to see water and this idea of fecundity, babies, women, all of this kind of making the earth bloom the way those JNF videos had been. The difference is that we also see this technology idea that we don't see in the American Western, because we have a lot of scientists coming into this Western film showing how to help develop the soil. So that it's youth, the cowboy is always youth, but you're allowed to have these older people, you're allowed to have the urban Jew coming from the city to help with the project in some way. And that's something that we never ever see in the American context.
Yeah, would you say that these Westerns, and again we're talking about really a handful of titles, were they particularly ideological compared to the landscape of Israeli cinema at the time? It was also ideological. What I'm trying to understand is whether the Western as a medium lent itself more easily to being co-opted in this sense.
So it was certainly more ideological, and it had a lot of mythologizing of the pioneering experience. And this is in fact why they failed cinematically, because audiences weren't actually that interested in pioneering experience. They were like, great, this is a fabulous myth, this is part of our history, but can we relegate it to history? And we'd like to see some shoot-'em-ups and some cops and robbers and some more detective-flavored films. And so audiences themselves weren't terribly interested in this. Mm-hmm. The best of all of the cowboy films, the one that was probably the most successful, is called Cholot Lohatim, Blazing Sands, and was a German co-production. Mm-hmm. And that actually engaged with real political issues of the time. The film is with Dalia Lavi, and this film actually became the vehicle that took her to Hollywood and made her into an actual international star. And that also helped audiences who were extremely proud of the fact that they had this Israeli woman that they could identify. And there were several starlets of this period.
Why was it better than the others?
So the story is about a woman who is dancing in a nightclub, and her boyfriend has disappeared. And it turns out that the boyfriend has gone to try and get to Petra. And this was something that was actually happening in the period, that a lot of youths were trying to go to Petra, which was across the border. It was a dangerous mission. And we see a tension between the Israeli authorities, who are afraid that, when these youths go across, they're going to get killed. But it's also creating a national tension, because the Jordanians think that these are infiltrators who are coming to spy rather than youths off on an adventure. And so many of the youths did get killed. And when the film came out, several people tried to get it banned because they thought it would promote
Which
this.
was when exactly? What year?
The film came out in the early 60s. And it sort of referenced both youth culture of the period, listening to music, hanging out in Tel Aviv, a kind of secular modernity, but also this thirst for adventure, the idea of going out into the West, having real experiences, facing the Bedouin who's shooting them from the hilltops. And so it has a real sense, but it's also unheroic, even though they're on this quest to go to the caves. And it has this Jewish element where in the caves, we're not looking for a pot of gold, we're looking for scrolls, Jewish biblical scrolls that will echo the kinds of scrolls that were found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, partly for their financial value, but also for their religious historical value. But in the end, everybody dies. It's a terribly tragic film. And it sort of relates to the super westerns of the period, because this is, in American context, the period where we're getting the big super westerns and the start of the spaghetti western. But by 1964, Uri Zohar makes fun of all of this in A Hole in the Moon, Chor B'Levana. And we already see the genre as dead for Israeli audiences who really are looking for something more contemporary in their viewing experience.
Uri Zohar was a pioneering filmmaker in many, many ways. And 1964, as you said, was the year that Hole in the Moon came out, his first film. He went on to do many others in the coming decades that, as you said, took all these themes and turned them on their head. Such as what?
So if you see that in the film, he has a lot of the cowboy symbols in it. We see men in cowboy hats and lynchings and this flat western town in the style of the cowboy films. But he was also a very difficult man to work with. The script had originally been written by Amos Knan, and Uri Zohar, in his inimitable way, was improvising on set, was making up things overnight. He was very erratic in how he worked, and so the lack of structure and the kind of chevreut that was coming from the theatrical background, the sketch shows that he was working with, meant that it had a very erratic feel to it. Now, he was trying to impose a kind of French new wave, artistic, self-referential, hyper-consciousness about the very way in which we create narrative and stories, this imposition that we have, the idea that narrative isn't flat.
It was overtly anti-ideological.
Right. It was overtly anti-ideological, but it was also about a critique of how art itself and how narrative itself is a constructed vehicle, which was also a criticism of how Israeli ideology was structuring itself and the pioneering myths. The problem is audiences weren't ready for that kind of aggressive anti-ideological position.
Did they get the message at all?
I think that they enjoyed the slapstick, but that they generally found his films unwatchable because there was no kind of narrative line that audiences were familiar with. And this was often a problem for all of this, the new sensitivity group, that audiences didn't want to go see these films. And like the European art cinema that they also didn't want to go see. They wanted to go see the trashier things.
Critical reception of Hol B'Levana?
Oh, critically it was hugely well received, and it was seen as this new way of breaking the mold. There was also a problem with how these films were funded. The Israeli film industry was funded by the Ministry of Industry. So it was considered a kind of industrial product. Therefore, it should have a market like factory work. And therefore, it had a bottom line value, instead of as art, where it has no value other than its artistic sensibility. And that conflict was really hard for these kinds of artistic films. Whereas Bareka's films, which were bringing in huge audiences, these were big epic productions, often melodramas, things like Salah Shabati, which is coming out in the same year, had no money from the government because they weren't really seeing... Salah Shabati was a privately funded enterprise, and it was huge. It was hugely popular with audiences. It went on to have a hugely long, financially profitable career. And audiences wanted to see things that were cute and funny, but not as obviously artistic.
The thing about Salah Shabati is that it was not only entertaining, it also had a very strong political message.
Right, so it was also ideologically subversive, and you see in the discussions of colour and race, there's a famous scene in it where Salah Shabati is talking about a dog, and that the black dog is never right, it's always about the white dog. I mean, this is a real criticism of Israeli cinema and Israeli culture at the time, and yet, because of the mode in which it's delivered, it wasn't seen as disruptive in the way that something like A Hole in the Moon was.
So 1964 was really a watershed year for Israeli cinema.
The whole decade ends up being a really important moment because it's really this move from a small cottage industry to large-scale productions. It's a move from the small local into an international stage. And at the end of the decade, suddenly we have the rise of television. And then that changes the nature and the function of cinema for the public.
All right, Dr. Rachel Harris, this is all very, very, very interesting. Thank you very much for joining us today. You're an Associate Professor of Israeli Literature and Culture at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And thank you very much for joining us and talking to us about Israeli Westerns. Who would have thought?
Thank you, Gilad.
And also big thanks to Alex Benish, our sound engineer, and to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. If you like this podcast, there are many more where it came from. Just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick.
Long are the days when you're turning away from the reasons you strove. Long is the way when you're aching to say, but your teeth bite your